hi everyone. This is really scary, but I've heard that SHARP people are really nice, so you have no choice now, you have to be nice. I'm just going to begin by reading the abstract, not least so if anyone's here and they don't want to be, they have a chance to leave. This talk argues that using book history methods in the study of linguistic imperialism can bring political urgency to the former and socio-historical specificity to the latter. Approaching books as linguistic media and print institutions as agents and adversaries of the systematic construction of ephemerality might, the talk suggests, even help us recover creative forms from beyond the pale of their geographical conditions and historical moments. Drawing from the University of Reading special collections in 20th century African publishing history, shout out to the archivists here, and the ephemeral, non-existent archive of a little-known distributor of African books in inner city Birmingham, where my work is based. It offers a constellated perspective on the conference theme, Global Book Cultures, Materialities, Collaborations, Access, that takes in language and writing systems, colonial copyright and translation, the politically freighted status of books within official language policies, and the politics of distribution. Okay, that's the shtick. So if you hate it, now's your chance to run. Hi everyone, my name is Asha. It's really nice to meet those of you who I've not met before. This is work in progress. So this is a potentially terrible decision to present it on this scale. But I say that because I think, you know, I'm not necessarily taking a set of fixed positions here. And it would be great to kind of test this work out on you, to hear recommendations, to find out things I don't know, and you can do comments, not questions, if you like. I'm up for the comment. I might not have the answer to any questions, but if you have recommendations, I'd love to hear them. And I just want to acknowledge the approach that SHARP have taken and the formidable amazing four women have taken in putting the conference together, in rethinking how to do keynotes and maybe pulling from different career stages. And I'm one of the beneficiaries. And Swara and I, though we're terrified to be doing this, are also really stoked. So thank you. And just to acknowledge that. Okay, so as someone on the interested periphery of SHARP and of book history methods, book history methods have been particularly useful to me in solving certain kinds of problems in literary history. And that's been true to date in the work I've done on state literary sponsorship. And it's happening again for me right now. So it's particularly useful in the research I'm doing on linguistic diversity in 20th century literatures. I'm particularly focusing on African literature, but this is a larger question too. I'm particularly trying to add specificity to debates around quote unquote linguistic imperialism. And that's a term that is powerful, but also has sometimes been overgeneralized and abstracted and is quite fuzzy and baggy. So trying to think about how book history methods might add kind of specificity and help us think through what that might mean. And so to go towards something that might accommodate the kinds of complexities and histories that the question of language and literature actually throws up. Yeah, and in the African literary context, often the question of the language of African literatures has historically been a really morally weighted question. So trying to move towards something that thinks more about the material and institutional conditions of possibility. So I want to do that by exploring two fairly recent, or from the last 10 years, essays that I have found useful in my research so far. And both of them try to put African literary perspectives, the history of the book, and issues of language in conversation. My focus here is less on the essays themselves than in putting some of the ideas to work into case studies, one on the early 20th century African language novel, and that's the Reading stuff, and one on this distributor of African books from Birmingham. So I've never used a clicker, but hey, it works. So the first essay is from 2022, and it's by Ashley Harris, titled Early Sesotho, isiXhosa and isiZulu Novels as World Literature, in which she discusses what book history might bring to world literary studies, and in the context where she feels that world literary studies has tended to marginalize creative expressions from the African continent. She describes a settler colonial ecology whereby, and I'm largely quoting from her, paraphrasing from her now, whereby the dominant colonial language system seeks to reduce the quantity of information within the literary system by foreclosing the possibility of indigenous languages to vernacularize literary forms. On this analysis, print institutions are one of the primary mechanisms for a kind of foreclosing. They act as agents in the systematic construction of ephemerality. And she argues to decolonize our view of the contribution of African writing to world literature, we not only need to apprehend the systematic investment in colonial languages over indigenous ones that has formed the global field of letters, but to chart, quote, through a certain amount of book history and spadework, end quote, the forms and writings that have become ephemeral by virtue of not conforming to publishing and linguistic standards of their time. So in doing this book history and spadework, we can kind of this history can be illuminated, but we also might recover a richer set of African creative materials than we've hitherto had access to or wanted to have access to. Harris's ideas about print institutions' construction of ephemerality are particularly clear when it comes to the genealogies of the 20th century African literature, but particularly the early 20th century first generation of African writers, which tend to be really elided in literary histories. So Chinua Achebe, perhaps one of the best known author figures of African letters, himself elicits these questions of lineage and visibility in his reflections on the publishing of his 1958 blockbuster, Things Fall Apart. I also meant to say, I've got loads of quotes on the screen, but I'm basically going to talk through them, so you don't have to read them, but if you get bored, you can read them. So he suggests that in trying to forge a writing career in 1950s Nigeria, there was, quote, no African literature as we know it today. And despite various kinds of predecessors, both in European and African languages, both oral and written literatures, he had no real sense of the acceptability of his English language novel or its likely reception in the world beyond. Achebe's words are interesting in ways I haven't got time to go into today. They index a precedent, they also kind of disavow it, and there's more to say about that. But the specific issue of print institutions and the ephemerality of this earlier literature is illuminated in the exemplary case of one of the predecessors that he does cite, Peter Nwana and his Igbo language novel, Omonoko. This is the cover of Omonoko. And Omonoko was published in 1935 in Igbo, and it was translated into English in 2014. And it's set in late 19th century colonial Nigeria, so it's set in the same-ish time as Things Fall Apart. And it charts the journey of the protagonist, Omonoko, who strays beyond the safe confines of home and gets into all kinds of risky misadventures. And the novel is really thematically invested in kind of, you know, in notions of the local and staying at home and the bad things that happen when you stray beyond. In an interview on the blog Africa in Words, and shout out to Kate Wallace, who I think is on Teams listening to this, who's one of the co-founders of that blog, the translator of an Omonoko, who is a critic of African literature called Ernest Emanyonu, explored how the novel's sentiments about local belonging and the risks of foreignization took on a material life of their own in the novel's publishing and translation history. Asked by Kalapi Sen why Nwana's name rarely appears in any of the surveys of African literature, Emanyonu points to the scant literary criticism on creative works in African languages. And he basically says, you know, Africa-based critics have done hard work in trying to draw attention to this literature, but effectively they're limited until it's published in English, and then a wider pool of people can do literary criticism. So he says scholars elsewhere are limited in what they can do because they are not proficient in the African languages in which the works are written. They cannot do much until the works are translated into languages of global access. This is the case with Omonoko and its author. So this is about works that travel and works that don't, and the literary criticism that can happen or not happen as a result. The interview establishes an important irony and a question. How a text recorded as the first published fiction in Igbo, one that's been widely studied in the regional education system in Nigeria and is regarded as a literary classic among Igbo readers, can have taken so long to be published in English translation. It was over half a decade behind other classics of African language literature, for instance, by Thomas Mfolo or Dio Fagunwa. The answer, although Emanyonu's translation was complete in 1972, its original publishers in England would not give permission for the translation to be published. So Emanyono had to wait for copyright to expire. When we think about Omenoko as an elided work in the genealogy of African literatures, then we need to think about the intersection of language, translation, and rights, and of print institutions as agents of ephemerality, for instance, by withholding permission to translate. Such processes of domination not only affect how we write literary history, but have all kinds of real-world effects in terms of the practical availability of materials to subsequent generations. And according to the Kenyan publisher Henry Chikava, this was a trend more widely. So he writes in an essay from the 1990s, he writes about the weaponization of licensing by, quote, selfish and opportunistic publishers in the North, which obstructed African publishers from acquiring the rights to their own first-generation writers. Okay, this so far so good. Publishers, print institutions as agents of ephemerality. But we can also build on Harris in a different direction. If print institutions, I think I might have some graphics, exciting. If print institutions can be agents of ephemerality, it is also true that they can be adversaries of ephemerality. For instance, by interrupting the structures determining the location of literary property in the North in the first place. So my second case study, the Birmingham-based distribution cooperative Third World Publications, which I'm going to say TWP, which I think is shorter than Third World Publications, but it might get annoying too. Set up in the early 1970s, TWP was a mail-order distributor of campaign literatures from British-based NGOs. And its self-conceived radical purpose shifted decisively in the mid-1970s when some of its members were on a family holiday and they ended up doing an inadvertent tour of the major independent publishing houses on the continent. Raven Books in Scotoville in South Africa, Tanzania Publishing House, East Africa Publishing House in Kenya, and others. And arising from this experience, another purpose was added to TWP, which was, quote, to import books from southern countries and introduce them to readers in the North. And to do that through a complete UK distribution, sales and representation service, all handled from 151 Stratford Road in inner city Birmingham. So from the mid-1970s until 1990, I'm actually going to go back, until 1990, TWP was one of the most significant distributors importing books from the global south, particularly from Africa and Latin America, into Britain. And we can talk about how I found this out by accident in questions. This is all accidental research. It worked through an ecology of alternative bookshops, left, green, feminist, hippie, the whole shebang, black. And it supplied these bookshops and they sustained it. It actively enabled alternative epistemologies and black radical intellectual traditions to gain readerships and audiences in Britain. As one of the former interns or members of TWP, the sociologist of education, Paul Warmington, has written about. And this is almost one of the only published things written about TWP. And it's in a preface of his book. He writes, in the 1980s and 1990s, I was lucky to work at Third World Publications in Birmingham, one of a now diminished network of black and anti-racist publishers, distributors, and bookshops. Third World's makeshift warehouse was, for me, a second university and a first-rate library. Such a great phrase. I spent 4 years shelving, boxing, and reading what seemed to be a boundless compendium of black writing. Cedric Robinson, Ron Ramdin, Amrit Wilson, and Sivanandan. Yet some of this important work that was in circulation then is now less widely read and is, in some cases, out of print. I noticed this in the work of my students, excellent and exciting young thinkers who were well versed in bell hooks and could cite Malcolm X, but for whom Una Marson, John LaRose, and even C.L.R. James were hazier figures. So, the domestic multiculture that Warmington's describing was connected to a global book culture. TWP linked up localities, situations, and readers, so that if you were a visitor to the Walter Rodney bookshop in West London, which at that point in the 70s was being firebombed by the National Front and other far-right groups, you could feasibly read Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which had originally been published by the Tanzania Publishing House. This is exactly kind of symptomatic of what TWP is doing. Between 1972 and 1982, TWP distributed 250,000 books from 76 independent publishers in 10 countries, including significant titles in African literary culture. And I mean, this is the most amazing photo in the world. And one of the black members of TWP did tell me it really wasn't as white as this. But you know, there's more to say. I love how they're hiding behind the books, like early Photoshop. And if you want to geek out and really try and zoom in, you can see all kinds of really interesting titles in African literary kind of culture. Raven editions, books by Eskia and Prele, books by Taban Loliong, all sorts of really interesting names. So in these various ways, TWP as a distributor represented a print institution that was actively acting against the ephemerality of African literature, alternative African literatures, by importing independently published African-made books into Britain. And yet, TWP is almost, apart from stuff that's been written by the founders, completely neglected in the research, partly because of its non-commercial status, it's a cooperative, but also because of what one journalist called the relatively hidden and unglamorous world of distribution as opposed to publishing. So, on one level, to think about linguistic imperialism with book history in mind means reckoning with print institutions as agents and adversaries of ephemerality. And what Ashley Harris calls the careful book historical spade work that we need to do will be about bringing these things, these contradictory things into view and enabling in the process maybe the recovery of some cultural forms. Okay, essay number 2. The second essay I've been thinking with was published in the SHARP journal, Book History, shout out to the editors, and is subtitled Reclaiming the Future of Book History from an African Perspective. And here Peter MacDonald invites us to see the field, this quote, to see the field as involving the study of communications across all linguistic media, oral, manuscript, print, and digital. So this is partly about decentering the book and seeing the book as one expression of many kinds of linguistic media. So this idea of books as linguistic media has been quite fun for me. Approaching books as examples of linguistic media or rethinking the material book through language is particularly rich in my context because of the interplay between materiality, language, and authorizing institutions. And we see this particularly in the different orthographic editions of Omanuko. So there's an edition from 1935 which uses the Africa alphabet, which is a kind of imperial alphabetic invention, orthography. You get later editions which revise that orthography significantly. And suffice to say that these different orthographic editions kind of index changes that are happening at the state level in this enormous controversy around orthography. How do you write African languages? How do you convert sounds into characters? What does that then mean for printing the book? All of these questions are in play. Do you use diacritics to mark tonal changes? Do you not? Do you use international phonetic symbols? Is that a foreignization? All of these debates are happening. And so suffice to say, I could have spent ages just doing this, and I actually did. And it was something I was really tempted to do, like, let me just stay with the material book. I can chart the changing fates of written Igbo in relation to print literacy, state policy, etc. And in some cases, different linguistic editions, different orthographic editions constituted new copyrightable works because it was sufficiently different from what went before. So we could spend lots of time here. But to stay here risks, according to MacDonald's essay, treating these as relatively atomized, interesting material artifacts. And the piece warns us it risks fetishizing the material book and to produce a series of interesting but kind of endless case studies. Because the essay argues it would involve mistaking the book as the primary object of study instead of the relations that the study of the book opens up, the kind of world it allows us to see. And to see these relations, the essay actually points us back to the Robert Darnton's communication circuit, which despite various kinds of criticisms and correctives and reworkings, MacDonald still finds valuable for its internationalism and for its holism, i.e. in focusing on the complete act of transmission. So what would it look like to think about Omonoku in that way? So these are just more slides of the same changing set of editions. So if we were to think about the internationalism and holism of Omonoku rather than just stay with it as a material artifact, we might note many things. We might note that, sorry, I've just gone back on myself. Okay, what I'm going to argue basically is thinking about it more holistically and more internationally actually helps answer the question about why the copyright was withheld and why that had such a material consequence in withholding it from people who might bestow kind of literary attention and critical attention. So a more holistic view might note the circumstances of the novel's composition in the first place. The process why a popular spoken story acquired a life in writing for the first time, and that was in response to an inter-imperial competition to stimulate literary writing in African languages from the 1930s. That was why the novel got written, for a writing competition. Its history of publication might also be relevant. So it might be important to think about the fact that the novel was first published by a Methodist missionary press, where it was known in the ledgers as, quote, Igbo storybook. It's a code I'll use about it. Before entering the highly contractual realm of British trade publishing as part of Longman's African and Oriental language series, a list that was at a firm distance from its literary publications. It might also note that Omonoku was prescribed under the new West African Examinations Council in the 1960s, and this underpinned a lucrative new schools edition, which you can see there, and this was guaranteed sales for Longmans. Such a view would also make relevant the localization of Longman's trading operations in Nigeria from the early 1970s onwards, as the Nigerian federal government issued an indigenization decree, and this was part of moves against neo-colonialism in multinational publishing. But this law from the federal government created Longman Nigeria. And those changes to ownership structure created a new publishing category, something known as Nigeria exclusives. And these were titles that were deemed to have no market beyond its country of origin. And it was all of this which underpinned the refusal to grant translation rights. But it did not prevent bootlegged English adaptation from popping up in a serialized comic form in a regional Anglophone Nigerian newspaper to trail a new unsanctioned translation that was forthcoming with Longman's rival in Nigeria, Evans Brothers, Nigeria. A holistic perspective then might note that the delay in the novel's appearance in translation in 2014, and through that its ability to enter into the English language world market, was all entangled with this stuff. And there's a really interesting story to tell about how Longman Nigeria refused translation rights in order to stay ahead in the Igbo language schools market. And it did so by appropriating anxieties about Igbo language rights against English following the Biafran War. So it basically was a publisher saying, we're protecting the Igbo language from English, and that's why you can't have the permission for translation. So all of that is kind of interesting. But we might also note, in a more holistic view, how this playful, irreverent adaptation in the comic totally changes, partly by what it's doing with the English language, how we think about the novel as something which only is all about local sentiments and local belonging and the risks of foreignization. So those kind of thematic investments of the novel become transformed. How we read them become transformed by this history. That's quite a lot. I'm going to come back to some broader points now. So focusing on the complete act of transmission or something more like it might tell us about the relations that are actually structuring African literary space at this time, rather than just focusing on the material book as a kind of atomized object. However, it is also true that a close focus on the communication circuit or something like it isn't the only option available to us. So we could just focus on a single aspect, in this case, distribution, with TWP in mind. And actually, we can think through that one factor and it can open up a world of relations. So distribution can open up a world of relations that can also help us rethink literary history and historiography. Oh yeah, this is a little bit of the archive. I probably haven't got permission to share very much. But this is them saying, we see you've tried to bootleg our property. No thanks. Okay, distribution. So TWP is interesting for me because it goes beyond issues of representation, i.e. it is about how do we strike a different posture towards the so-called third world? How do we diversify our bookshelves to include more work made from the continent? But it also goes beyond just that. TWP's work as a distributor allows us to link the microhistories of specific African literary titles that have been imported into Britain with larger questions about the locations and production of African authorship. So in other words, TWP is buoying publishing infrastructures on the continent by developing pioneering distribution relationships from Britain with Africa-based presses. And those are the same presses that are best placed to support a multilingual publishing ecology. So it does this by recognizing that to give a commercial, it does this by recognizing that to increase the numbers of Africa-based authors or African writers that might actually publish with local publishers as opposed to the big ones in the north, it needs to show that there can be a kind of, you can have a commercial future for your novel. So these distribution relationships are kind of showing that there is a market by publishing with Indigenous publishers. I hope that makes sense. So that was the idea of TWP anyway, to support that publishing ecology and to actually increase the numbers of African authors publishing locally. So stepping back, a closer focus on distribution would also help us see the ways in which TWP exposed the economic structures that were left over from the imperial era, which saw books exported to the continent from Britain in an overwhelmingly unidirectional manner, and, for instance, structured the flow of books from neighbour to neighbour on the continent. So one of the 1982 leaflets from TWP noted, quote, "We even sell African books to Africa because the colonial trade routes through London still monopolise communication between neighbours." So TWP's work as a distributor is exposing the fact that these structures are still very much alive and well. So these acts staged a reimagination of the power dynamics of the book trade by making explicit the structures that were shaping the terms of trade. And in this respect, maybe, playfully, it modelled what the political theorist Adam Getachew calls world making after empire, i.e. decolonisation projects that reorder the world to try and create domination-free or more internationally egalitarian orders beyond the nation state. So we often think about decolonisation as being about nation building. Actually, there were all these kind of international efforts to reimagine the world. Maybe we can think about TWP in those terms. So this world making through distribution was encoded in TWP's status legally as a cooperative. So by trading for the benefit of members rather than for shareholders, TWP staged the question, who benefits from publishing? And given the enormous dependency of the British book trade on African educational markets well into the 20th century after independence, this was not a minor question, but a really major question. Lastly, I'm almost done. This close focus on distribution might also be instructive for scholars who are interested in the sociology of literature. And the sociology of literature, one of the things it's been trying to do recently or in recent years has been to grapple with the forces and conditions shaping literary production and literary worlds, particularly in relation to major international organisations such as UNESCO. How does that kind of an organisation shape literary culture, literary production, literary worlds? And these are the kinds of organisations we might position in the political and social conjuncture of Robert Darnton's communication circuit, for those of you that know that. So, arguably, something as low-lying and precarious and as ambitious and influential as third world publications deserves to be accounted for in relation to a body like UNESCO. One was grappling with difficult internal debates on book development and the terms available to decolonized countries in the 70s and 80s, where you had Euro-American content producers on one side and developing countries that were kind of content consumers on the other side. That's the UNESCO. The other exceeds all of this supernatural policy discussion, bless you, exceeds all of that big policy debate and is looking for practical ways to work outside of the prevailing market conditions that govern the circulation of literature across nations and that govern the flow of knowledge internationally. Now, TWP is never going to compete with UNESCO in terms of power and significance and the books that might be written on it, but it does represent a compelling challenge to it. And one advisor to UNESCO on book development or on the kind of uneven structures of global communications, a guy called Keith Smith, who wrote a paper for UNESCO in 1977, you can see it on the screen, is precisely the person who tries to point this out. I met him recently and he's totally bemused that people were interested in his work. But I was like, we are, your work is great. So in 1982, TWP celebrates its 10th anniversary, and it does so with a tour of books, African-made books, across libraries in inner city Birmingham. At the same time, UNESCO's World Congress of Books assembles in London. 2 parallel events, same time. It just so happened that Keith Smith, who had worked for UNESCO, had become a director and an advisor of Third World Publications. He casts a rueful glance at the UNESCO gathering that's happening in London and basically claims it would be better for the funds to be spent on direct action projects like Third World Publications than talking shops like UNESCO. It's kind of a great moment. So, in other words, by focusing on the specific role of the distributor and its processes, we might actually bring into view the kinds of countermeasures and interventionist projects that a sociology of literature scholarship might be really interested in. But it involves creating space among the macro level structures for these kinds of grassroots activities. And I would also argue that we need to do the book history work to do this stuff. You're not going to find it by just, looking for it on the internet, because it doesn't really exist. So I'm going to finish now. I don't think I've got any slides. Yeah, this is the closing slide. What is the payoff of all of this stuff? Approaching linguistic imperialism with book history in mind might bring political urgency to what we do as book historians, but it might also bring socio-historical specificity to phrases, to terms like linguistic imperialism. What does that really mean? It would involve, according to these essays, approaching books as linguistic media and attending to the relations opened up by studies of that media, rather than just focusing on these kind of atomized material artifacts. And in the process, we might stay open to the ways that print institutions act prohibitively in a foreclosing way, but also in an enabling and opening up way as agents and adversaries of this kind of ephemerality. And both do. In fact, as you do the kind of more holistic approach, you see how both things are happening. What Ashley Harris calls book historical spade work might bring possible routes to effaced materials and effaced sources. It might help us recover creative forms like Omanuko and the reasons why it was prevented from accessing kind of critical attention, or it was delayed so long. Or it might help us begin attending to grassroots distribution co-ops like Third World Publications, which is really kind of laying out, like punching way above its weight in challenging the global structure of communications. It might release those things from being really localized historically and geographically. I'm going to end there. Thanks.